Parliament's having its first ever Scrutiny Week. It's an idea borrowed from Australia, apparently, to improve oversight of government actions. Select committees will call ministers and department bosses in for questioning over the government's spending plans.
Well, I think it will lead to better scrutiny of what the government's up to.
Normal sittings of the House are on hold, and instead ministers sit down in front of select committees to defend their budget plans and their portfolios.
The Scrutiny Week is one of the changes that was made at the 2023 review of standing orders, and it came from feeling in the committee and from a number of people that made submissions that Parliament, particularly select committees, were not scrutinising the work of the government particularly effectively.
Kia ora, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, Newsroom's senior political reporter talks me through Parliament's first ever Scrutiny Week. What happened? Was it worth it? And what did we discover? Mark Dalter, welcome once again to The Detail.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And we have just experienced Scrutiny Week, the first one. Tell me what that is.
Yeah, so Scrutiny Week is a new innovation at Parliament, modelled a little bit on a special select committee they have in Australia called the Scrutiny Committee. It'll happen twice a year, and it replaces normal sitting weeks in Parliament where you have question time and legislation moves through the House. Instead, once after the budget and once at the end of the year for each department's sort of annual review, ministers and department chief executives and related officials will show up before select committees for often quite long hearings where the majority of the questions go to the opposition. They're able to engage in sustained lines of questioning to really figure out, in this case, the post-budget one, what money is being spent, what are the impacts of cuts that have been made, and what are the next steps for government in some of these new, key policy areas.
So what advantage is there in doing that rather than just having House time?
Yeah, there's a big advantage in doing this over question time because really question time doesn't get anyone any answers. It's very performative, a lot of grandstanding. This takes place in select committee rooms. People are sitting down, which helps, and the people that they're questioning are only a couple meters away from them, looking each other in the eyes and able to have more of a conversation. That's not to say there wasn't any argy-bargy. There was plenty of that.
Nicola Willis frequently butted heads with Labour's finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds.
You talked about the cuts that you're going to need to do to public services. You've also talked about...
No, I haven't talked about that. Those are your words from your mouth. Please don't attribute words to me that I have not used.
Paying to public services or efficiencies or greater delivery.
And there is a big difference, and the sooner you guys get to understand it, the sooner you'll be seen as fiscally responsible.
But I think there were opportunities for real discussions, real questions, and real answers, which you don't get in question time. And as compared to a select committee hearing, which we do have normally, the post-budget one is called the estimates, and then you do normally have annual reviews as well. But these are longer and more consciously shaped in terms of how the rules are set down for, giving the opposition a chance to hold government to account. And so I think it's broadly likely to be more effective than a regular select committee hearing where maybe you just don't have the time to actually get into the details.
Okay, is that why Newsroom has made a point of covering every session?
Yeah, so we haven't managed to cover every session. We've got 4 people in our team in the gallery, and there were many, many dozens of hours of hearings, but we think we've covered about half to 2/3 of them between the 4 of us, which I think is hopefully a pretty impressive accomplishment. The reasoning being, if this new Scrutiny Week is designed to hold politicians to account, if the public doesn't know that that's happened, it isn't hugely effective. Yes, there's value in the opposition being able to get answers to their questions and factor that into their policy making and that sort of thing. But the public accountability, the public scrutiny role is only served if news media are also covering this. I also think that's why it's helpful that there wasn't a House sitting this week, no question time or anything like that. It gave media, including us, more time to be able to focus just on these hearings rather than any other sort of issues that might have been going on.
It's interesting that it almost relies on journalists to be part of this process.
Yeah, I think if people hadn't covered it, if it had been treated more like a standard set of select committee hearings, which happen all the time, and people go to ones that interest them and miss out on the others. it would have been fine, but not particularly helpful for the public because people wouldn't have known about the kinds of questions that were being asked and the kinds of answers that were being given.
Did you get answers? What did we learn over that week?
It depends on the minister, it depends on the chair of the committee and the quality of the person asking the question. There's a lot of factors that go into whether you're going to get a real answer or not. So some concrete things we learned, for example, Shane Jones has talked in the past about creating a bond scheme for oil and gas developers so that if a future government comes in and reinstates bans on fossil fuel development, they would get paid out by the government. And he revealed in the Resources Committee hearing that he had been told by officials that this just wasn't a workable idea.
Is he still going to go ahead with it? I mean, that's government policy, isn't it, to do it anyway?
I think this sounds like he might be trying to find a way to do something similar, but the exact idea sounds like officials have kind of put the kibosh on that. But Derek Chang has reported in the Herald about the Social Development Minister, Louise Upston, saying that the money for some of the tax cuts is coming from reducing the minimum wage for people with intellectual disabilities. That'll drop to as low as $2 an hour in some cases.
A long-running debate's been reignited over how much disabled workers are paid. Nationals opted not to implement Labor's plan to pay vulnerable workers the minimum wage through a subsidy scheme.
I have never been convinced that the alternative that the previous government was looking at putting in place would support more disabled people to be employed.
Critics say that amounts to exploitation.
It just shows that government does not respect disabled people nor workers. Disabled workers are served the same entitlements as everyone else, including being paid at least the minimum wage.
So these are some concrete things that we've gotten out of the hearings. Alongside that, we've also learned things about the government's priorities and beliefs and approaches to different portfolios. So, for example, I was at the Conservation Select Committee hearing where Conservation Minister Tamo Potaka said he thought it might just be too expensive to save every species and he'd like to see some costings on that before he made that commitment, which is quite unusual for a conservation minister.
If we say, hand on heart, we're going to save every single species and get it out of a space where it's endangered or at risk, that job is going to take an absolutely probably superhuman effort. That'll cost, I don't know, I wouldn't want to imagine the cost, but that is literally hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars.
This was the reaction from Labor's Carmel Sepuloni.
He put on a really bizarre performance across his portfolios when he presented to select committees. I think what we all saw was a lack of depth. He is not over the detail of his portfolios.
There are realities around how much things might cost, but usually you go in from the starting point of we are going to try and save things, not we're going to figure out which species are most cost-effective or least cost-effective to let go extinct.
Well, did every conservationist in the country draw their breath at that one?
Yeah, I think people were quite surprised, quite shocked.
I was actually horrified by the minister's comments. He's basically picking winners, right? He's essentially saying, well, I have an underwhelming ambition to not save them all because it's really expensive, and so, we'll pick some things that we might like to save. He's forgotten his job.
That's been one of the kind of headline bits that have come out of this week of hearings, but there are others as well. Clashes over things like the government's failure to fund 13 new cancer drugs that the National had promised before the election. Shane Reddy kind of doubling down a little bit on why that hadn't happened.
And then on Friday, while Mark and I were talking, it sort of did happen. Stuff said it understood that the government was expected to announce a record-breaking medicines boost of at least $600 million as a way of keeping its promise on cancer drugs. Cabinet ministers are expected to decide today if they'll significantly boost Pharmac's funding.
It sounds like the government is looking to boost Pharmac's budget to help it pay for those drugs, although which drugs are selected may be different from the 13 specific ones that National listed during its campaign. It sounds like Pharmac will still be the agency making those decisions in the end. Also, at least at the time that we're chatting, it hasn't been signed off by Cabinet yet, so details could change. But, that's an example of this scrutiny from Scrutiny Week, but also from press conferences, from politicians' interactions with the public, from question time, and just all the interactions the government has had since the budget, where this has come up again and again and again. forcing a policy change, which wouldn't have happened without that level of pressure and that level of questioning.
We had the opportunity to dive into those excuses from the government about why. And I think the first thing, they have tried to shift the blame on this. But the fact is, we know now they're running off to find the money.
Labour's health spokesperson, Aisha Verrill, former minister, was pretty fierce, wasn't she? I mean, was she using political experience and tossing in a bit of grandstanding, or do you think she was really trying to force points out of the minister?
I think it can be both, right? I think that politicians, the questions can be political. They will be political. I think some people maybe had come into Scrutiny Week hoping it would be very non-political, but that's always going to be difficult when your job is to hold the government to account or your job is to be the government. Of course, you're going to be attacking or defending those policies respectively.
Make it a good Pepsi.
If you could just summarise what you think New Zealanders can be most proud of.
Oh my God. Mr. Chair, please.
Some dignity we have some dignity as a committee, surely, Mr. Chairman.
But I think the mere fact of there being some drama and some energy is not problematic. It's when that takes up all the space and you can't actually get into substantive points. And I don't think that's what happened in these hearings. I think the questioning was serious and ministers really did have to answer those questions, even if they didn't answer it in a way that was maybe satisfactory to the opposition. But it was still quite a lot more robust than the kinds of answers that they're required to give in the House.
Did it showcase the good and bad, the ministers who are right over their portfolio and the ones who are a little bit shakier?
Yeah, I think we came out of this week learning quite a few things. The ministers who are across their portfolio and the ones who aren't. And on the side of the ones who aren't, you kind of had two ways of approaching this. One was maybe the Tamapōtaka way of it felt like he was winging a lot of what he was saying and just kind of engaged in a group brainstorm sesh about what the government's conservation policy could or should be. Or you had ministers who were deferring a lot to their officials, to their department chief executives and to other experts in the areas. And that's not a bad thing inherently. There are some questions that will be technical or some questions that are really just not the minister's place to answer, much more of an operational decision. And that's a good time to throw to your officials. But when you're throwing most or all of those questions to officials, it becomes pretty clear that you're just not quite across your portfolio. Maybe that can be forgiven. It's the first time we've done this in general, but also, we're only 7 months or so into this new government. So it'll be interesting to see which ministers have better performances or worse performances when the next set of hearings come around. The other thing that we saw is some of the backbench MPs and the opposition MPs. You could see who was really good at getting those questions in and who wasn't. My colleague Laura Walters was watching the hearing for the Children's Minister, and she felt that some of the questions from the Labour MPs were, like you're saying, too political, didn't really give the minister an opportunity to actually answer, came with all these, laden with these assumptions and premises that the minister is, of course, going to disregard and spend too much time arguing over that than the point that they're actually trying to get to. But she said that Green MP Kahurangi Carter was a lot better at actually getting the substantive points answered and addressing those. So you got some of that highlighted, as well as the select committee chairs, most of whom are government MPs. Very, very different, range of performances there. People on the Environment Committee, run by Scott Simpson, were really supportive of his approach. He was really permissive in allowing quite a wide range of questions and ensuring that the opposition was able to continue their lines of questioning.
It's about financial analysis, and ultimately that's important for Parliament's scrutiny of taxpayer spending.
Lots of arguments on, say, the Economic Development Committee with Chair Parmjit Parmar. Often these select committee chairs feel like they have to run interference for ministers to try and kind of interrupt those lines of questioning and throwing to government MPs to ask patsy questions. And you could see which chairs were more willing to do that versus which chairs were taking a sort of more good faith approach, I think.
What patsy questions? Why are they even allowed to stand up and say, can the minister please inform me of all the good things the government's doing? I mean, can they just not say, ban them?
That's definitely something that's been mooted after this week. MPs are going to go away and have a think about how Scrutiny Week went and hopefully improve it for next time, because everyone agrees that there is some room for improvement, exactly aware that people will differ depending on their party and their experiences. But one of the ideas that the opposition is certainly floating is why should government MPs have any questions at all? Shouldn't it just be the opposition asking if the point is scrutiny? I think you can have government MPs asking good and insightful questions, and that did happen sometimes over the course of Scrutiny Week. In one case, in the climate change hearing, for example, ACT MP Simon Court was actually one of the fiercest questioners of the climate change minister, because he clearly disagrees with the approach the government is taking on climate change. He'd like a much more sort of free market, hands-off approach than what Minister Simon Watts is doing. So it doesn't mean that government questions have to be useless, but a lot of them are time fillers. Things like, yes, can you tell us a little bit more about how this spending will improve people's lives? And maybe that's useful as a high-level summary, but the minister gets an opening statement, which they're presumably going to be using to talk about how the spending is going to improve people's lives. So do you really need to ask it again? And does that fulfill the intent of Scrutiny Week? Probably not.
Name names for me, Mark. Who stood out with leadership material? Who stood out as having the sharpest minds? I mean, Winston Peters seemed to be completely relaxed and at home with being questioned.
Yeah, Winston Peters was very okay to be questioned. It was apparently about 15 minutes into the Foreign Affairs Committee before he actually got his first question, because of some of that chair stuff that I was talking about earlier, where opposition MPs were trying to ask questions and the chair just kept ruling them out of order, saying they needed to be much more closely tied to the budget. And he said something like, well, this is the first time I've ever been to a select committee, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, where I wasn't allowed to be asked about foreign affairs. So he was keen to be questioned. He was open to it. Although about halfway through the hearing, he then did say, "When did we start doing this Scrutiny Week thing? Why are we doing this anyways?" Which maybe showed he needed a little bit of a better briefing. James Meagher in the Justice Committee was similarly, a fair arbiter, I think, of the questions, allocating them in the right way, giving the opposition the time it needed to do that scrutiny work.
The whole week is treated as a sitting week in Parliament, just dedicated to select committees. So you are expected not only to turn up and participate, but to be on precinct as well. The other thing that's changed is that the amount of time that ministers are expected to turn up has at least doubled, I think, on most select committees. And that's to give the parliamentary side of it, the legislators, a good amount of time to scrutinise the spending plans of government.
While also maybe trying to tamp down on some of the argy-bargy, some of the politicking that got in the way of the purpose of scrutiny. Parmjit Parmar, I mentioned, Stuart Smith on the Finance and Expenditure Committee. Not the best showings as chairs in terms of opposition MPs. Carmel Sepuloni was quite interesting on the Social Services Committee. She wasn't full on in her questioning, but she would just occasionally lob a question in there that was quite pointed, quite effective. Maybe the staying above the fray thing kind of works. I thought Chloe Swarbrick on climate issues was asking detailed questions, and the minister, to his credit, was often able to answer those without needing to defer to officials. Although maybe the quality of those answers, people will differ on whether they got the answers that they wanted. In terms of ministerial performances, Shane Jones, not particularly strong, but I didn't get the sense in the Resources Committee that he cared all that much about the perception of being across the detail. He seemed quite happy to say, this isn't my strong suit, and I'll let someone else answer that question, and kicked a question down the road to Simeon Brown as well at one stage, who's the energy minister. Simeon Brown also on the energy issues, not really across the detail there. Brooke Van Velden on internal affairs, quite a lot of deference to the chief executive of the Department of Internal Affairs. Though I think with that portfolio, it covers such a wide range of things. You've got fire and emergency, you've got archives NZ, you've got digital safety online. Like, I can understand for that one not fully being across all of those details in all of those particular areas. In terms of ministers who performed quite well, I thought Judith Collins was able to have some quite interesting discussions on government digitisation. She did seem to be across the detail, which is never a given in sort of the tech portfolios like that. So that was good to see. Jerry Brownlee on the parliamentary service. He's the Speaker of the House, so he's the kind of person who fronts up on those issues. It led to some interesting discussions about security for MPs, and in the vein of his predecessors, was quite happy to share some of his thinking around these issues. He's not as much of a not a political role per se, so maybe more able to have constructive conversations rather than the back and forth and that sort of thing.
Does this point up a sort of an issue with the lack of scrutiny the rest of the time? Is, for example, question time a waste of time?
I love question time.
Yes, but it's the theatre though, Mark, isn't it?
Yes, I don't love question time because I think I get serious information out of it. I think that would be fair to say. Is it a waste of time? In the grand scheme of the amount of time that probably goes into it, which is maybe 3 hours a week during sitting weeks, of which there are, say, 30 in a year, 90 hours a week, that's a decent amount of time to use up of Parliament's time, of 128 MPs' time for something that probably doesn't get that much of an outcome. But maybe there's value in doing question time so the MPs get maybe tuckered out, so when they get to the next stage of the day and they start actually legislating, they can put some of the politics aside and start working on the policy. Because if you didn't have that outlet, they'd have to have those political arguments somewhere, right? And you don't want that unnecessarily spilling over into when they're actually making decisions about things and making laws and changing them and repealing them.
Right, so it's like taking toddlers out for a game of football before their afternoon nap.
Yeah, or taking maybe your second grade class out for recess, and then you get down to the learning afterwards because they wouldn't be able to do any serious work if they hadn't had the chance to kick the ball around or play tag.
Oh my gosh. Do you think this sort of thing will lead, though, to better policy making? I mean, for example, if politicians thinking through their policies, knowing that twice a year someone's going to put them on the spot over them?
I think it's hard to draw direct connections like that, but the more opportunities for scrutiny and accountability you have in the system, the more that factors in on a maybe subconscious level to how people make policy. And I think you've seen that in the coalition government's sort of changing approach to policy, where they came in, they said, we've got a mandate to do all this stuff, and they just started doing it. And now they're starting to run into social license issues, even from people who agree with what they're doing, but they just don't agree with how they're doing it. Things like the fast track bill, just the massive use of urgency by Parliament. The government's starting to realise, actually, maybe we need to rethink our approach here a little bit. So that's not because of any one scrutiny or accountability measure. It's not because we have the weekly post-cabinet press conference and the Prime Minister knows he's going to have to answer those questions, so he'll make different decisions because of that. But it has this layering effect where politicians know they are accountable to the media, to the opposition, to the public, and the more opportunities there are for that scrutiny and that accountability, the heavier that weighs on that side of the scales. If we had none of this, if the Prime Minister didn't do any media conferences, if there was no scrutiny week, if it was only question time and then the opposition was shut away in a room until the next day, if we weren't a democracy, governments would make decisions very differently. So this is part of that layering of checks and balances and democratic accountability measures that means the government, acts like it's accountable to the public.
So you're looking forward to December when we do it again?
I really am. I think overall I would say that Scrutiny Week was a success, with the caveats that it was the first time we were doing this and ministers were still getting used to their portfolios. And so I'm really hopeful that we will have learned lessons from this. We will incorporate those lessons into how it's done at the end of the year in December, and the ministers will be more across their portfolios so we can build on it. I think if it just stayed at this level of quality forever, that would be disappointing. But with the context that this was the first one, I think we did a pretty good job. And I think it'll be good to see it grow and improve over time.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production with the support of RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Davina Zimmer and Sharon Brick-Kelly. Thanks to Newsroom's Mark Dalder. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.